I'm going to be doing something which might not work for all of you, but and quite different to a lot of what I've been hearing. I'm dealing with the challenges of working with digital literacy and doing digital literacy research in situations where there isn't lots of money, lots of resources, high connectivity, and so on. I want to make the case that if one looks at how digital media work in these situations, you learn a whole lot of things about how they work everywhere, which is not really visible in context where digital media are freely available and people are very used to them in various kinds of ways, because lots of things become invisible as to how they get constructed and how they get used. So maybe at the end I'll ask you what was generally applicable from my discussion, and if you don't have anything to say, then you weren't listening, or else I didn't make it clear. We're looking at no, we have heard that the new media are worldwide and global, and we saw examples of distributions across various countries. But Africa was very absent in a lot of the data that was presented, either because people had forgotten about Africa or just because the data is bad coming from Africa. But Africa is a huge continent, and it would be wrong to say that Africa is just a dark continent without media and without rich people. Like any other part of the world, it's characterized by considerable wealth, perhaps on the hands of fewer people, and access to resources, but a lot of people who don't have access. And even if you do have a lot of money, you still suffer from a low bandwidth in Africa, although it's getting better. This picture doesn't have anything to do with my talk. It's just
distraction.
To keep you distracted while I'm talking to you. But just to show that even Mark Twain had things to say about whether these machines were moral or immoral, and we carry on. A lot of the discussions about the new media in Africa talk about the digital divide, and it's a nice catchy phrase. We hear it a lot, and I don't need to say too much about it. But the problem with a lot of digital divide rhetoric has been that the consequences. These kinds of analyses are very popular amongst government officials, because if you say the digital divide, then you're talking about the lack of equipment, hardware, and so on, and you can address it by getting budgets and putting machines in place. And there have been interesting examples of World Bank programs where they've created community tele-centers in remote villages in Kenya and in other parts of Africa, and watched to see what happened. But it's assumed that if one puts these resources, these rich, knowledge-rich resources into places like that, that the knowledge would flow down the tubes and would enrich and expand and delight and enlighten local people. And the early experiences of these rather expensive but dramatic programs of putting the internet into remote areas have been quite odd. In many cases, these resources have been very popular, and in some cases they've been removed from their sites quite quickly. But in other cases, well, predominantly internet put into villages has been used for telephonic purposes, for people to phone remote members of their families, because that's what they really wanted to do, not to investigate the white noise of the internet, which is not nearly as transparently useful as we might think, because we are used to sorting our way through the internet. The other purpose was of people going into these telecentres was to use typing facilities to construct CVs, because people want to be able to produce CVs so they can go and look for work. So the internet didn't feature terribly well in those early experiments. So people have come to say, well, it's not enough just to put computers in place. We also need various other things to bridge the divide. And I don't know if you, well, you probably read him more than me, but Mark Warschauer has been one of the most interesting commentators about, I think, about computers and the digital divide. And he's identified what else needs to go in when you want to bridge the digital divide. And obviously the first thing it needs to go in is the physical resources, the computers and the connectivity. But obviously also the other thing that needs to go in are digital resources. Certain kinds of software and certain kinds of programs and packages that are going to be useful and in the right languages and so on. I'll show you later on the kinds of educational software that finds its way into poorly resourced schools in Southern Africa. And then we can say there's a problem with the digital resources. The other thing that's needed are the human resources. You have to have people who know what to do with them, and if you're working in educational context, you have to have teachers and developers who can get people to use these resources productively and creatively. And social resources. These things have to have some kind of function and make some kind of sense to local people. None of these things come automatically with the technology. Of course they don't. Once you look at it like this, so we tend to talk about the new media as if all these things are kind of packaged when we get them. This is often how one hears people talking in Western context, because these other things tend to be invisibly in place in various kinds of ways. When they're not in place, then different things happen. But there's a problem with Warschauer's model, because it assumes that all you need to do is have those things, put them in place, and things will kind of happen. And this is my particular take on all of this, is that the new media, like all kinds of communicative resources, anything that's sign-based, operates in different ways depending on the social setting. Signs don't travel and carry their meaning intact with them. Signs are read and interpreted by people who are located, and they use their local resources. So you can't put together something that you think is wonderful and give it to somebody whose conditions and interests are different, and assume that what you've given them will flow into them and transform them and make them as enriched and enlightened as you are. Because that's not how things work. That's not the way communication happens. Any kind of literacy is always a situated literacy. Literacies are distinctive ways of communicating, communicative resources that work in certain settings. And the same applies to the new media. So this is the problem. When ICTs are injected from the outside, they can't work in a way that's anticipated from people outside the setting, because they have no idea what the practices are into which they get embedded. People work with the things they have in ways that make sense locally, according to the concerns, conditions, and interests that they have. This is what I've been saying. Media resources operate in specific ways in any setting that they go into. And this is what gets lost in a lot of interventions. Interventions that get put together from the outside, go into settings, and they encounter people leading their lives in ways that make sense to them. And these resources get taken hold of in locally relevant ways, or they are redundant. They don't transform the setting. This is what we learned from the new literacy studies, the anthropological studies of literacy in Iran and Guinea-Bissau and so on. People take hold of new communicative resources in ways that make sense locally. And the problem with a lot of the literature and the arguments about how the new media work are that they are based on successful users in Western contexts, generally middle-class people. And a lot of the literature doesn't actually identify that. The literature says this is the way these things work, and this is what the kids do with it, without saying particular kids. And I'm sure that even in Western contexts, if you look across different socioeconomic contexts and different levels of social access and resources, you'll see very different things happening with the way children use the new media. There's been one interesting study that I know of in Australia, looking at children in working class homes who have access to computers at home as part of a government program, and the consequences of home access don't translate into success at school for all kinds of reasons. These children are still identified as losers, as illiterates, whereas at home they are the family expert on how to do a whole lot of informational technological things. So there are things which are worth looking at in a bit more detail about the resources. So there's a kind of this has to be an American cartoon, but this is not all children think like this. It's very different for a lot of African children in sub-elite schools. And in every country in Africa, you will find children connected, but those will be a small group of schools. And it's very different for children coming from different backgrounds. Computers at home are just not the norm at all. So if children encounter computers in schools, they will be encountering them perhaps for the first time. Pretty much the way that children have encountered literacy, reading and writing, in schools for the first time across Africa. We make all kinds of assumptions about home and literacy, and the same thing applies to computers and literacy in African settings. So, so what's the conceptual point I'm trying to make, and why should I be trying to harangue you with these points? That reading and writing are not the same thing across different contexts. They don't, in a way that language is not exactly the same thing. Forms of language don't necessarily have the same meaning across different settings. This is a point made by linguistic ethnographers. We have a sense that form and meaning in language are in some ways closely connected, but ethnographic research shows that meaning is a local thing. We can have all kinds of ways of using language which seem to be identical across settings, but are not. So, for example, we had one example today when a girl in Kenya said, now I feel modernized. And modernized in the West means, oh, now I feel connected up to information and technology. But in Kenya, that might mean, now I've joined another group who are the important people in this area. It's purely, these things mean different things. So language and information contained on screens are not the same things, or not read the same, don't have the same meaning, if the social settings and the social practices are different. This is basically saying the same point, that even if they appear to be identical, they are different depending on the conditions into which they get inserted. And this is a bit obscure, but I'll show you what I mean when I look at children Googling in classrooms. Because Googling seems to be a fairly straightforward activity. We know how it's done and what we do with it. But that's just because we share, many of us, the same practices of Googling. So my point is that digital practices have meaning in relation to their context of use, not independent of their social settings. Reading effectively and correctly is a situational thing. Who decides what effective and correct is? When we are looking at screens, we don't see images. We see through the images in particular ways to give them meaning, and those ways of seeing through are cultural ways. So the same multimedia text on screen is not the same across every setting. We kind of imagine it might be if we are hopelessly middle class, but it's not. People will respond and react, and we know this from all kinds of things. Somebody was reminding me about the coke falling from the sky film. Who was that?
God's Must Be
Yes, right. And how it takes on different meanings, and that's the way that signs are socially contextualized. This is the standard take on the basic literacies of reading new media, coming from a well-regarded American academic who says we used to teach the basics of the old literacies. Now we need to teach the basics of the new literacies, and this is how this is what we should be teaching. So it's about using a search engine effectively, evaluating accuracy and utility of information on websites, using a word processor effectively, including functions such as checking spelling accuracy and so on, participating effectively in bulletin boards, listservs and so on, knowing how to use email to communicate effectively and referring correctly information. This is obviously out of date because things move so fast. However, it's interesting that this claims to be a basic list, but all the criteria are outside of the list. So what is correctly and what is effectively? None of those things are given, and these are all social things. So effectively would be what one assumes to be effectiveness in certain settings. None of those things are clear from this kind of definition. And there's also the same assumption that's applied to early literacy instruction, that you can teach the basics in a kind of an independent way, neutral of the actual uses of these things. So you can teach literacy by teaching phonics and teaching a bit of this and a bit of that, and at the end people can go and use those things. So this is the problem. If we think of digital literacy as an autonomous matter of technique, how to use these things, we also think we can train people to do these things well. And this is what happens when resources go into school. People put together programs which include a succession of disconnected, disembodied skill exercises. The alternative view on these things is to remember that one can't teach skills independently of some kind of social load that resources carry. That if you are drilling phonics in early literacy classes or getting people to Google in certain kinds of ways, you're also communicating certain social values as to what is good and what is bad and what counts. So, and my point is, as I'll go on to show you, is that the social load attached to these resources is not predictable and doesn't come with the resources independently of their use. So when anyone is doing anything on the internet, they're not just using certain kinds of linguistic, semiotic, literacy coding knowledge. They always are making statements of identity and social value and social importance, and always working within particular semiotic frames. The one thing about digital access in African context is that it isn't terribly multimodal because of low bandwidth and so on. So we're talking about a lot of texting rather than working with images that are digitally dense and take a lot of bandwidth and so on. So we see interesting things happening in terms of the new literacies in relation to children and cell phones and writing, which I'll go on to talk to you a bit more about. But what we're seeing are interesting things happening around language and digital literacies. And I'll get to that in a little while. Well, let me take you through this. This is an example of children texting each other, and it's a Mixit site, and Mixit is part of the new vocabulary in South Africa. Mixit is a software website service set up which anybody can use, and they can use it for texting purposes, and it's much cheaper than texting through cell phone providers. So everyone is, and particularly the youth, are going on Mixit, and it's possible to have chat groups on Mixit. There's a lot of digital stuff going on. But it's interesting to see what new things are happening around using digital resources. There are interesting and creative things happening with language, but there's also a reaffirmation of social identity, social place, social value, and people's concerns are very much located in place. There's no sense that people are being taken outside of their local setting. Perhaps I should read through it just so, because it's very much local English. Should I do that? Just to moi sexy is moi. Sexy is what one person calls herself, and it's for you to envy. It's creative use of names that people give themselves. But we got permission from people, from the writers, to use this data, I have to say. but it's quite sort of hot stuff. And it's a group of young teenage coloured youths. Coloureds are people who live in the Cape Flats. They used to be a marginal social group. They're neither black nor white. They're mostly descendants of the Khoisan people mixed with slaves and black and white people. They have a strong sense of identity, but they also live in areas where gangsterism is dominant and drugs are prevalent. Unlike you, I don't live in a coloured area like you. My girl, I live in Constantia, much more better than Mitchell's Plain. Oh my bad, you are coloured for life. Just because you live in a white skin doesn't make you any less a coloured. What's wrong with coloured areas? You cuck full of yourself. I'm not full of myself, I just got it all. My girl, you don't have the looks. At least I don't live in a gangster area where you don't learn anything. You learn to steal. My girl, here's so a lot to learn, your brains won't be able to handle it. There's nothing to learn, just a lot of drugs. You talk about do drugs, sexy. For your info, I'm clean. If you're not kham, you shouldn't chat in here, sexy. We all clean. That girl is clean. She never touched a cig or not okay, and never been in a jail. Kham is used to be the sort of, it's like queer. It was the word the word outsiders used in a disparaging way to describe that group of people. It's now taken on as a kind of an identity. If you kham, you are rough and ready, and but you're coloured. And a jol is the South African word for party. Everyone likes to jol. But this is just to show you how situated and localized exchanges are. People take hold of this media in ways that works for them. I'll come back to cell phones and the youths perhaps in a little while. Let me 5 to 4. Let me move on quickly to what's interesting about just that exchange is that what we see there is there's a very clear genre that's appeared, a way of talking which is produced by youths texting each other in that setting, and to be able to participate like this, you have to be a kind of an insider in that setting. The girl from Constantia was, I think, was going to be ejected from that group quite soon because she wasn't getting it quite right. But this is one example of how localized ways of using language and new media get established. And this is as much an established semiotic domain as academic lectures are. It's a language genre and forms of presentation become clear and solidified. That's what digital literacies are. Particular, established, developed ways of doing things. Literacy practices. Okay, now to look at things happening in schools. What happens when computers get put into poorly resourced schools where a whole lot of other things aren't in place? And this one way of looking at this data to say this is just an example of disadvantage and deficit and bad learning. But my argument is that this is a situated way of using the new media. New media are placed resources which operate in ways that work locally. Children go into the computer room and they sit in front of the computers and they have to sit quietly with their hands on their laps because that's the way things work in school, and then they go through very specific ways of doing things. Okay, now put your hand on the mouse, click on this, do that. They get taken through things step by step. The way they get taken through literacy, as if you learn things by simply following instructions, because that is the way things are done at all levels in these settings. That's what teaching is, and that's what learning is. This is normative ways of doing things in this setting. So this is an example of preschool engagements, and it's simply a question of holding on the mouse, clicking on balloons, and waiting for things to happen, and waiting for the teacher to come and say whether you're doing things right or not. People will come and say, oh, that's terrible, because children are supposed to be able to explore and use the mouse to go into places and learn how to do things. That's what computers make possible. But in this setting, that's not the way things are done. And this is not to say that it's the setting that's at fault. It's just that this is specific. This is called peripheral normativity. This is how things happen on the periphery. So the computers get turned into a sort of a step-by-step learning by imitation, which is the dominant form of learning in those settings. Copy learning and rote learning. Computers get turned into doing that. Alternatively, at higher levels, children go through some very problematic interactive lessons where the computer operates as a substitute teacher, where the computer asks information and the students have to click on things to get them right. And it's about very, very, very crude initiation, response, evaluation, classroom learning. What in the best cases, what pupils learn to do is just how to cheat the system. They just go and click on everything. So in one case, this is what this little girl had learned to do. She did everything that could be clicked on. She just clicked on it. So she clicked on the correct and the wrong answers, and the computer said, right, so you got everything right. And she said, look, is this right, miss? So there's a kind of a disconnect between the intentions of the software providers and the way computers operate in local settings. This is another example of children using problematic software in a school setting. The thing says, click on the main idea in each sentence. And what is the main idea in a sentence? The girl talks with a man with a red beard. What is the main idea there? The children don't know. But apparently that's what the main idea is. It's supposed to be about teaching grammar without using grammar terms. What they want is the main clause. She read the book from beginning to end. What's the main idea there? This is what students do. They think, well, she read book beginning end. That's the main idea. Kind of a summary. And the computer keeps on saying, no, you're wrong. It's she read the book. So there's all kinds of non-learning going on in relation to computers and software in schools. Software is interpreted in a specific local context, and it's not people aren't making sense of it the way it's supposed to operate, and the stuff just isn't very good. Google is very interesting because computer classes tend to be Googling classes, and in non-computer classes, it's quite common for teachers to write something on the board, and children will copy it down. That will constitute a lesson. Or they will be told to go and look for something in a book and to copy down a paragraph. So Googling tends to follow the same kind of thing. This is one example of a Googling lesson. Children were told to go and find out about apartheid on Google. So what they did was Google apartheid, and Google came up with the first page of results, and they went to the first site and wrote it down. The first page of results on Google on apartheid had absolutely nothing that was produced from anywhere in South Africa. The top site was an old computer student essay, exercise on apartheid from Stanford University. So they just copied the first paragraph of that lesson on
we sell our old essays.
Sorry?
We sell our old essays.
Yes. The irony is that what these students in Khayelitsha get on apartheid comes from Stanford University, which is where Google actually happened to be developed. So what's going on? Google's supposed to be neutral. What happens to African children when they Google? What do they get? Brennan Page said Google's going to clear up the clutter of the web in a neutral kind of way. So we're not going to be getting biased. There'll be no longer humans selecting the material. It'll be done neutrally. But what happens is Google selects the popular sites, the sites which happen to be in digitally rich countries. So you don't find, if you Google Africa, you won't even find anything from Africa there, probably. I was talking to some students about this recently, and they were Googling while I was talking. And this data is a couple of years old now, but the same stuff came up, except that the Stanford University site is now second on Google, and Wikipedia is first on apartheid on the list. So there's the page. The demonstration from Brennan Page in their paper as to how Google would work said they compared Alta Vista to Google, and Alta Vista just threw up a whole lot of garbage, and their method threw up a clearly worked out list of top universities. It just happened to be mostly American and one or two other universities. So it's a kind of, that's the internet isn't a source of pure clean information which flows down to grateful Africans. And yes, so Google rewards established pages, and these are very seldom African-based. The material that you do find in Africa tends to be sensational stuff about famines and wars and poverty and so on. That's one of the problems with using the material in African settings. This is just to show you some more data on children using Google to do stuff. And this is a standard Google class. Teacher says 2 topics: electrical safety and sound energy. Go and Google them and write down what you find and bring it back. Sound energy first, and then safety rules for electricity. So 2 students working together type in energy, what are the safety measures? Which is not quite what they were told, but and Google corrects their spelling, and then they get the closest measure is something which talks about new safety measures for Mastin Energy, a coal producer in Virginia, USA. And this is what they copy down. Two students next to them are not quite sure what to do, so they copy what they would do. So 4 students in total in this class have this as their answer to the question, and that's this was the second thing that they got. The first one seemed them to be even more irrelevant. So they took the second one. Right. So there's a kind of funny activity that goes on around computers and Google and using software in schools, which is particularly the case in these settings. Skill and drill software and Googling characterizes what happens in South African schools with computers. And the fact is that outside of schools, there aren't computers in poorly resourced settings. People don't have computers at home, but what people do have is cell phones. And I think this has been touched on before in a previous keynote, and this applies to poor African settings. That a survey was done in Khayelitsha, the poorest South African, or Cape Town township, where a couple of million people stay, and nearly all the children have access to cell phones. They might not have them themselves, but these resources are shared, and they and a lot of these cell phones have internet connectivity. But children generally don't even know that they've got internet connectivity. They don't go use their cell phones for going to look for information. They use them almost exclusively, apart from voice calls, for mixed conversations, for texting each other on Mixit, and there's a huge amount of texting going on. It's interesting that conversations on the part of Khayelitshan children, when they speak in isiXhosa, and when they text in English with a mix of Xhosa, because they enjoy that more. They find it more comfortable. But it's a kind of a free, invented hybrid mesh of local language, of a local Xhosa and English. So it's an interesting creative mix that's going on. And the question is, if you're an educator, what do you do with this complicated situation, with computers that operate in these relatively unproductive ways in schools, with a major crisis in schooling in terms of children not being able to read and write after 4, 5, 6, 10 years of doing badly on standardized testing, and some people who have some connection with have been trying to get children reading on their cell phones, and I'm sort of ambivalent about this project, but it's an interesting one, and the impetus for it comes from Japanese M novels. It's apparently very popular. Millions of people read these short novels that are constructed for cell phone reading in Japan, predominantly girls, female, young readers who download these short chapters off websites and read them for small amounts of money and really enjoy them. As an attempt to try to get township children doing this, because they are texting and because they are reading on their cell phones. Surveys show that they're not doing much reading off their cell phones at all, and not writing much except on their cell phones. So there's been this is the project developed using quite a lot of money from the Shuttleworth Foundation. Mark Shuttleworth is our famous astronaut who is now has a foundation that gives out substantial sums of money for development projects. It was called Contacts, and it was a story carefully constructed using it was supposed to be co-written by youth in workshops. It didn't work terribly well, so a writer was contracted and paid. Chapters were produced. An exciting story based in the townships, young people having an adventure that involved familiar things, using local language, running over a series of chapters. That was the writing of it. It was tried out. So quite a lot of money was spent on advertising it so people would know about it, and all they had to do was to have a cell phone, go to the website and download the first chapter for free. And quite a lot of people did that, in tens of thousands, and there was quite a lot of written response. A lot of kids enjoyed it, but there was a strong falling away after the first few chapters. People still aren't clear even whether this is a potentially viable source of getting young people to read more and to use the new media and to get them involved in using new media. But the argument for it is that mobile phones are the best available new media for young people in poor settings, and so they should be able to use these and get a lot out of them. The findings were that this was put out in 2 different languages. Some people were surprised to even read something like this in isiXhosa, the local African language, because they just hadn't read stuff before. Quite a few people read it in the African language and then went on to read the English language, which they were more used to reading in. There was just a mixed bag and a mixed uptake. Quite a lot of interest. It's not a low-cost exercise. It's not something that people, because it requires lots of advertising to get people to go there. These resources don't automatically just spread like wildfire. But it's also kind of transgressive, in my opinion, which is why it might not work in the long term. That people decide what they're going to use particular media resources for. And educators will always try to say, well, kids are using this stuff, so let's try and use it for educational purposes. The ones that are more successful are those that disguise the educational intention as much as possible. But nonetheless, kids aren't stupid anyway. And if it's not an established literacy, if it's not out there socially available, that young people will read novels, stories on their cell phones, it's difficult to generate that. And what youth are using their cell phones for is a particular kind of social activity. It's for social connectivity, it's for talking to friends, it's for information. So the attempts to piggyback on the ubiquity of cell phones in poorly resourced settings doesn't necessarily work for as a kind of an educational intervention. The jury's still out on this, and I think that it's going to take a long time before we find ways to make use of these resources, to intervene in the major educational challenges that we have in poorly resourced settings in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
So we have time for questions.
Well, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm just wondering if you can say a word or two about schooling practices in general and traditional literacy practices and texts and curriculum,
Yes.
which I think I'm guessing are all imported into these settings in much the same way that you're talking about digital texts
Yes.
and literacy. So was there that same kind, or is there that same kind of I guess, to choose a phrase, failure to transfer well?
Yes, yes. There's certainly a major problem with early literacy instruction in schools, because it's become, whether it's imported or not, if one looks at it through academic eyes, it looks like a very bad version of reading readiness phonic instruction from the 60s, from the USA, 50s, 60s, in some ways those resources have solidified, and they operate in schools in ways that are locally entrenched. So teachers were taught like that themselves. Teachers generally are not readers themselves. The teachers who are teaching reading will teach reading and writing as if it's simply skill and drill. There's no connection between the activity of learning to read and write and engagement with text for any kind of purposes of meaning making, pleasure, learning. So it's seriously problematic with huge consequences. And across Africa, there's kind of reading-like activities operating in schools which are not really reading, writing activities at all. So what's fascinating is to see that the way that the new media are reinterpreted using those particular understandings and those assumptions about authority and what relationships between teacher and children and knowledge that used to be the old literacies. The new literacies are getting refashioned in school in exactly that same way. So it's not simply that these are imported because they've been around far too long to be imported. They kind of make sense. This is the only way you can teach reading and writing in these settings in ways that you can cope. This is a kind of a locally available way of teaching reading and writing for fully resourced teachers, settings where there isn't much reading and writing. These aren't just examples of bad reading and writing. This is important. This is my important point to make. People hear what I'm saying and say, "Oh God, it's terrible. We need to retrain the teachers." But these ways of doing things have a deep ecological validity. They're deeply embedded in the way things operate there. They just have the effect of disqualifying people as soon as they move out of local settings, because they can't function when they get tested in standard ways from the center. But people are committed to doing things in that kind of way locally. Yeah.
Thank you, Mastin, for that great talk. I was really caught up in the complexity of what's going on with the Google ranking algorithm. In particular, you had referenced just before that Don Liu, who came and presented to us here not so many months ago on this very topic. And it struck me that in his definition of what these key new literacies happen to be, as the justification for coming up with those definitions, he also talked about students doing this very thing, choosing the very top entry that comes from a Google search and going directly to it regardless, and the lack of critical understanding and able to process the complexities of information online. I'd like to put this as just, obviously that's a socioeconomic based ranking, and that's what you've brought out, and that's what was not in Don Liu's analysis. What I'm interested in is, are there ways that you see around that? Is there a way to expand upon the work that you finished your presentation with using the Xhosa language, which wouldn't have the same already biased English, which is heavily biased in that socioeconomic sense for the ranking algorithm. Is there a way to work around that by incorporating more local language, dialects, and varieties, so that when you search Google, if you're using that term, you're not going to get something from Harvard? No.
People have developed alternative forms of searching which are more locally relevant and so on, but they don't carry the same status. And people don't want to go. Only the people who are told to go and use them and who are part of the project will use them. It's like we're having this conversation about YouTube. It turns out that the sites that get hit on it the most in YouTube are commercial, are bits of commercial stuff that are stuck on YouTube. That there's a social valuation. You can produce better stuff on your values, which are more progressive and more alternative, and are going to be better for people. You can convince you can say to people, it'll be better for you to do it like this because you'll be getting stuff which will make you engage with your reality and blah blah blah. But the point is, it doesn't quite work like that. It's still social value means people will go to the dominant sites in various kinds of ways.
But they could be critical of it. I mean, it is. The Stanford paper's down to number 3, by the way. Wikipedia is right at the top. So there's the lovely opportunity, not to support Google, but of the students looking and seeing how Africa is perceived and having the option of changing that, of actually editing. And then right up there is the African encyclopedia.
Yeah.
So it is that, in a sense, you do want to equip students to read Google.
Yes.
And to see that as an opportunity for them to engage critically with representation in the world.
Yes, but that kind of critical activity it's not a universal, socially universal, available way of engaging with meaning-making resources. It's fundamentally a middle-class way. It starts in middle-class homes. It's very difficult to go into schools anywhere in Africa and just say, okay, I'm going to teach you to be critical, because.
But they were critical in that conversation. They were getting after each other about the region they were living in and the fact you can't escape your identity.
Yes, no, that's not in the classroom. You see, that's what kids can do amongst themselves. Sure, but what happens in schools is so deeply. It's a kind of a juggernaut. It's not easy. It's easy for critical literacy people to say we need to go in there, bring the teachers out, give them a workshop, and they'll go in and the kids will learn to be critical. Teachers do these workshops and they have cognitive dissonance. How do we? It's okay. These things work fine. Teachers come to universities and do full degrees, and they learn to do wonderful critical things in simulated environments. But they say, that's not how things work when we get back to the classroom. So, I mean, I'm deeply committed to finding ways to making these kinds of changes happen. But they are far more difficult than a lot of arguments for critical literacy would understand them to be.
So Mastin, my question concerns, you were talking about the importance of kids engaging with their realities. But what I'm wondering is, what about kind of students' imagined identities? Maybe the whole point is that they don't necessarily want to engage with their everyday realities. Perhaps they do want to actually engage with another world, an imagined world, a desired world. So how do we negotiate that?
I think fictionalizing, engaging in fantasy through media is a learned thing, which is learned by middle class children through fairy tales and so on. we have to be careful about thinking it comes naturally to everybody. It's
I'm not so much thinking about fantasy as I'm thinking about doing things with your life that don't look necessarily possible if you look at the reality of your daily life, but you still might want to imagine that
Sure.
you could be a different kind of person in a different kind of world.
Yes.
So I'm not thinking of fantasy, well, it's a kind of fantasy, but fantasy, the small f, not,
Yeah.
not
Sure. The positive images from outside. So, but sure. But well, are you saying how would they get those?
Well, you know, just kids who perhaps want to travel, want to connect with the wider world, want to learn other languages, you know, whatever identity, be a doctor, you know, whatever
Yes.
that might be, which
Sure,
don't
of
look
course.
possible if you look at their daily reality, but in fact, there may be images there that
Well,
create
that's
possibilities.
the dream of education in Africa. Everybody is passionately committed to getting their children into as good a school as they can, because they want their children to move on and progress. This is, it's everyone dreams, everyone has ambitions, and education is seen to be the place for it to happen, and it doesn't happen. Schools pretty much don't do that. If you look at what happens to children in Cape Town, the notion that the children wake up in the morning, put on their school blazer and walk to the local school there's no such thing as the local school in the Western Cape, because schools are spread around across different complex socio-economic settings, and children all travel far from their homes and in different directions depending on the kind of social imagination that their parents have. So some children from the townships head in taxis off to the suburbs if their parents can afford it, or from townships off to Mitchell's Plain to the coloured schools, because they seem to be better than the township schools and so on. So, but everyone disperses all over the place. So everyone's dreaming, everyone's trying to get out of, improve their lot. So it's not that people don't have intentions to succeed. It's just that there aren't any easy or clear routes at all, because the resources are limited. Not many people get there, and their schools tend to work very much to exclude people who don't come from already well-established backgrounds. But for example, these children in Mitchell's Plain, if they dream of wealth and resources, they look around and they see the people in that area who have got wealth and resources and look smart and drive nice cars are the gangsters. That's clear. And there's the possibilities of getting work are not very high, because there's 80% unemployment in that area. So people's imaginings get complicated by social reality.
Thank you very much. I think we will stop the formal questions at this point, but there will be lots of opportunities both this evening and tomorrow to continue conversation and questioning and discussion and dialogue and all of those things that have been happening all day. I'd like to invite you to thank Mastin for bringing to us a rich element to the already rich dialogue that's been going on last night and today, and to offer you a very small token of appreciation for the work you've done. So thank you very much.